Before we dive into the most extraordinary story of underground discovery and redemption you'll ever hear, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Trust me, you'll want to be part of this conversation. Now, what I'm about to tell you sounds impossible. It's a story that begins with the most unlikely hero, a man dismissed as a foolish dreamer, and ends with an entire scientific establishment brought to its knees. This is about the day the Nullarbor Plain revealed its greatest secret, and the moment one humble explorer proved that the greatest discoveries aren't made by those who think they know everything, but by those brave enough to admit they know nothing at all. The Nullarbor Plain. The name itself means no trees in Latin. 1,000,000 square kilometers of absolutely nothing stretching across southern Australia, the largest single piece of limestone in the world. Flat, barren, desolate. For decades, geologists, scientists, and explorers had written it off. The consensus was unanimous. Beneath that featureless expanse lay nothing of interest. The surveys had been done. The assessments were final. The Nullarbor, they said with absolute certainty, was as empty below as it was above. But they were catastrophically wrong. This is the story of Dr. Marcus Webb, and how he discovered not just caves, but humility itself, buried deep beneath the Australian outback. And more importantly, this is about how a group of amateur cavers, dismissed, mocked, and nearly destroyed by the very institutions meant to support them, became the most important explorers of the 21st century. Let me take you back to where it all began. Dr. Marcus Webb wasn't always the chief director of the Australian Geological Survey. 23 years ago, he was a promising young researcher with a doctorate from Cambridge and a hunger to make his mark. He'd published papers on karst formations, limestone dissolution patterns, and subsurface hydrology. His CV was impeccable. His confidence was absolute. And when he was appointed to lead the Nullarbor Geological Assessment Team in 2002, he saw it as a stepping stone to greater things. The assessment took 3 years. Ground-penetrating radar, seismic surveys, core samples extracted from hundreds of locations. The conclusion of the 847-page report that Dr. Webb personally authored was unequivocal. The Nullarbor Plain presents a geologically stable, largely non-porous limestone formation with minimal subsurface cavity development. Further exploratory efforts in this region would constitute an inefficient allocation of research resources. In layman's terms, there's nothing down there. Don't waste your time. That report became the Bible of Australian geology. It was cited in dozens of subsequent studies. It informed policy decisions about land use, mining operations, and conservation efforts. And it gave Dr. Webb exactly what he wanted: a reputation as the definitive authority on Australia's subsurface geology. By 2015, he'd risen to become the chief director of the entire Geological Survey, a position of immense influence. He sat on government advisory boards. He determined which research projects received funding. He was the gatekeeper of geological truth in Australia. And he never, not for one moment, questioned whether his 20-year-old assessment might be incomplete. Enter Thomas Hendricks. Thomas was 54 years old, a former telecommunications engineer who'd taken early retirement to pursue his lifelong passion, caving. He wasn't a geologist. He had no advanced degrees. His formal education ended with a technical diploma from a community college in Adelaide. What he did have was 30 years of weekend caving experience, an inexplicable intuition about limestone formations, and a beat-up four-wheel drive truck named Beatrice. Thomas had assembled a small team of fellow amateur cavers: Sarah Chen, a high school geography teacher; David Okonkwo, a Nigerian immigrant who worked in warehouse logistics; and Emma Fitzgerald, a 26-year-old barista with a YouTube channel about Australian wildlife. None of them were scientists. All of them were obsessed with caves. They called themselves the Nullarbor Speleo Society. The name was optimistic, considering that according to every official source, there was nothing to explore beneath the Nullarbor. But Thomas had a theory. He'd been studying old Aboriginal oral histories, stories passed down for thousands of years about the singing stones and the water beneath the thirstlands. He'd noticed peculiar circular depressions in satellite imagery that didn't match the radar data from Webb's survey. And most intriguingly, he'd discovered discrepancies in the seismic readings, subtle inconsistencies that suggested the surveys might have been conducted during an unusually wet period that could have masked cavity formations. When Thomas submitted his research proposal to the Geological Survey's grant committee, requesting a modest $15,000 to conduct exploratory drilling at 3 specific sites, the response was swift and brutal. Dr. Marcus Webb personally wrote the rejection letter. "Mr. Hendricks," it began, While we appreciate your enthusiasm as an amateur hobbyist, the Geological Survey cannot allocate taxpayer funds to investigations that contradict comprehensive, peer-reviewed scientific assessments conducted by qualified professionals. Your hypothesis is based on anecdotal, indigenous folklore and amateur interpretation of satellite data. The Nullarbor subsurface has been thoroughly mapped. There are no significant cave systems. I would encourage you to redirect your recreational interests to regions where legitimate speleological opportunities exist. The letter went on for 2 more paragraphs, each sentence dripping with condescension. It concluded with a suggestion that Thomas consider taking some introductory geology courses to better understand why his theory was impossible. The letter was devastating. Sarah wanted to quit immediately. David started looking at caves in other regions. Even Emma, usually irrepressibly optimistic, began to doubt. But Thomas read that letter differently. He read it 50 times, analyzing every word. And what he saw wasn't just dismissal. He saw fear. He saw a man so invested in being right that he couldn't afford to be wrong. He saw a man who hadn't actually addressed any of his specific data points, only his credentials. He didn't say I'm wrong, Thomas told his team at their next meeting. He said I'm not qualified to be right. That's different. So Thomas mortgaged his house. He sold his deceased father's coin collection. He maxed out 2 credit cards. And with $23,000 of his own money, the Nullarbor Speleo Society bought a portable drilling rig and headed into the outback. The first site they chose was a subtle depression Thomas had identified in the satellite imagery, about 70 kilometers north of the air highway. It was March 2024. The Australian summer was ending, but the heat was still merciless. They set up camp with 2 tents, a portable generator, and enough food and water for 3 weeks. The drilling began at dawn. 20 meters down, solid limestone. 40 meters, still solid. At 60 meters, David was ready to declare defeat. They'd spent $8,000 already, and all they'd proved was that Dr. Webb was right. But at 63 meters, the drill bit suddenly dropped 15 centimeters in a fraction of a second. "We've got void," Thomas whispered, his hands shaking on the drill controls. They pulled up the core sample. The limestone was hollow with dissolution patterns, the unmistakable signature of water erosion. There was a cavity below them. Over the next week, they drilled 7 more test holes in the immediate vicinity. 5 of them revealed voids. They'd found something. They'd actually found something. Thomas immediately tried to contact Dr. Webb. He called the Geological Survey's main office. He sent emails. He even showed up at the Sydney headquarters in person, covered in red dust from the Nullarbor, holding core samples in his blistered hands. He was turned away by security. Dr. Webb's assistant eventually responded with a terse email. Dr. Webb does not have time to review unsolicited amateur findings. If you believe you have made a discovery, submit your evidence through the proper peer review channels. The peer review channels, of course, meant submitting to journals whose editorial boards Dr. Webb either sat on or heavily influenced. It was a bureaucratic circle specifically designed to keep outsiders out. Frustrated but undeterred, Thomas did the only thing he could think of. He contacted Emma's YouTube channel subscribers. Emma had about 15,000 followers who watched her nature videos. She posted a raw, unedited video of their drilling operation, the core samples, and Thomas's explanation of what they'd found. The video got 847 views. But one of those viewers was a geology graduate student at the University of Melbourne named Dr. Priya Kapoor. Priya had her own complicated history with Dr. Webb. He'd rejected her dissertation proposal 3 years earlier, calling her methods insufficiently rigorous. She'd eventually completed her PhD, but the sting of that rejection had never fully healed. Priya looked at Thomas's core samples and saw immediately that they were legitimate. She reached out and offered to help them navigate the scientific establishment. But she also warned them. Dr. Webb doesn't just have influence. He has his entire reputation invested in that Nullarbor report. If you prove him wrong, you won't just be correcting science. You'll be destroying a career. He will fight you with everything he has. She was right. When Emma's YouTube video started gaining traction, eventually reaching 50,000 views after being shared in geology forums, Dr. Webb could no longer ignore it. But instead of investigating, he attacked. He gave an interview to Australian Geographic magazine titled, "The Problem with Amateur Science." Without naming Thomas directly, he described the Nullarbor Speleo Society's work as dangerous pseudoscience conducted by unqualified hobbyists seeking attention. He claimed their drilling methodology was riddled with contamination risks, and their core samples were inconclusive at best, fraudulent at worst. He went further. He contacted the State Mining Authority and filed a formal complaint claiming that the Nullarbor Speleo Society was conducting illegal drilling operations without proper permits. He was technically correct. Thomas hadn't realized he needed a commercial drilling permit, assuming his small-scale operation fell under recreational use. Within a week, Thomas received a cease and desist order and a fine of $45,000. The message was clear: go away or be destroyed. The mainstream media picked up the story, but not the way Thomas had hoped. The headlines read, "Amateur cavers face legal action after illegal drilling scheme," and "Geology enthusiasts accused of falsifying cave discovery." Dr. Webb appeared on a morning television show, looking composed and authoritative in his suit and tie. The host asked him about the controversy. "Look," Dr. Webb said with practiced concern, "I understand the romantic appeal of discovery. We all want to be Indiana Jones. But real science requires rigor, peer review, and proper methodology. These individuals, well-meaning as they may be, simply don't have the expertise to interpret geological data. Their voids are probably just natural inconsistencies in the limestone density. The Nullarbor has been comprehensively surveyed by actual scientists. I led that survey personally. There are no significant caves." The host nodded sympathetically. "So you're saying they're wasting their time?" Dr. Webb smiled, a patient, pitying smile. "I'm saying they're out of their depth. And that's dangerous, both for them and for the integrity of Australian science." Sarah quit the team that night. She couldn't afford to be associated with what the media was calling a geological hoax. David had visa renewal concerns and couldn't risk legal trouble. Even Emma took down her YouTube video after receiving threatening messages accusing her of spreading misinformation. Thomas Hendricks was alone. $45,000 in debt, facing potential criminal charges, and universally dismissed as either a fraud or a fool. Most people would have quit. Thomas went back to the Nullarbor. He couldn't drill, he'd been legally prohibited, but he could explore. With just his own equipment and supplies, he returned to the site. He spent days examining the surface topography, looking for natural openings. Aboriginal stories mentioned breathing holes in the thirstlands where cool air rose from below. On the fourth day, in a shallow depression obscured by spinifex grass, Thomas found it, a narrow fissure in the limestone, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Cool air was flowing from it. Not just cool, cold, damp. He attached his caving gear, checked his radio beacon 3 times, and descended into the fissure alone. The passage was tight, claustrophobic, angling steeply downward through jagged limestone. Thomas squeezed through gaps that tore his shirt and scraped his skin. His helmet light bounced off the walls, revealing ancient watermarks and mineral deposits. He descended for 40 minutes, his heart pounding, until suddenly, the passage opened. Thomas emerged into a chamber so vast his headlamp couldn't find the far wall. He was standing on a ledge overlooking what appeared to be an enormous subterranean cathedral. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. Stalagmites rose from below like ancient pillars. And in the center, illuminated by his light, was an underground lake that stretched into the darkness, its surface absolutely still, reflecting his light like a mirror. Thomas stood there, alone in that impossible space, and wept. But he didn't have a way to prove it. He was banned from filming or collecting samples under the cease and desist order. And even if he could show the world, who would believe him after Dr. Webb's character assassination? Then Thomas noticed something on the chamber wall. Marks. Not natural formations. Carved symbols. Ancient Aboriginal art depicting spirals, water, and human figures. These caves weren't just undiscovered. They were sacred sites, known to Indigenous Australians for millennia and forgotten by colonial history. That's when Thomas knew what he had to do. He returned to the surface and drove for 6 hours straight to the offices of the Anangu Pijanchachara Yankuni Chachara Lands Council, the organization representing the traditional owners of the region. He met with Elder Douglas Maitland, a Yosi Yosiai, 72-year-old Pijanchachara man who served as the council's cultural heritage advisor. Thomas showed him photographs of the rock art on his camera, taken despite the legal risks. Elder Douglas studied the images for a long time in silence. Then he looked up at Thomas with tears in his eyes. "My grandfather told me about these places," he said softly. "The old people knew. They always knew. But when the white scientists did their surveys, they never asked us. They came with their machines and their papers, and they said there was nothing there. We tried to tell them, they didn't listen." "Will you help me?" Thomas asked. Elder Douglas smiled. "Son, you're going to help us. You found our sacred places. Now we're going to make sure the world knows what's down there. The Indigenous Lands Council had legal authority that Thomas didn't. As traditional owners, they had the right to conduct cultural heritage surveys on their land, and that included the Nullarbor Plain. They filed for an emergency heritage protection order, citing Thomas's discovery of rock art as evidence of significant sacred sites. The application couldn't be dismissed or blocked by Dr. Webb. It went through different channels: cultural heritage protection rather than geological research. Within 3 weeks, a formal government-mandated expedition was organized, and Dr. Marcus Webb, as the chief director of the Geological Survey, was required by law to participate. The confrontation was inevitable. The expedition assembled at the site on a scorching October morning. There were government officials, Indigenous cultural experts, a documentary crew from the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and of course, Dr. Marcus Webb, accompanied by 3 of his senior geologists. Thomas Hendricks stood near his battered truck, wearing the same dust-covered clothes he'd been living in for weeks. He looked like he'd aged 10 years, gaunt, sunburned, exhausted. Next to him stood Elder Douglas, dignified in traditional clothing, and Priya Kapoor, the graduate student who'd remained his only ally in the scientific community. Dr. Webb arrived in a pristine, air-conditioned SUV. He stepped out wearing designer field clothes that had never seen actual dirt, his expensive sunglasses reflecting the harsh outback sun. He took one look at Thomas and didn't even try to hide his contempt. "Well," Dr. Webb announced loudly to the assembled group, "let's get this circus over with. I've got a conference in Singapore next week, and I'd rather not waste any more time on this situation." The government liaison, a nervous young woman named Jennifer, stepped forward with a clipboard. "Dr. Webb, the Heritage Protection Order requires a full investigation of—" "I know what it requires," Dr. Webb cut her off. "Let's be clear about what's happening here. This man," he gestured dismissively at Thomas, "has made extraordinary claims based on zero credible evidence. He's violated drilling regulations, wasted government resources, and now he's manipulating Indigenous heritage laws to avoid legal consequences for his actions." Elder Douglas stepped forward, his weathered face calm but firm. "With respect, Dr. Webb, those sacred sites belong to my people. If this man found evidence of them, we have every right." "Sacred sites," Dr. Webb interrupted with barely concealed derision. "You saw some scratches on a rock and you're calling them sacred sites? I mean no disrespect to Indigenous culture, but we can't let folklore override scientific fact. I surveyed this region comprehensively. There are no significant caves here. This entire exercise is—" "Then prove it," Thomas said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. It was the first time he'd spoken. Dr. Webb's smile was vicious. "I'm sorry?" Thomas stepped forward, his voice still quiet but steady. "Prove it. You said there are no caves. I'm saying there are. I found one. I've been inside it. So either I'm lying or you're wrong. Let's settle it right now." Dr. Webb laughed, a sharp, mocking sound. "You want me to go caving? Is that it? You want me to crawl around in some tiny crack in the ground that you've convinced yourself is significant? I'm the chief director of the Australian Geological Survey. I don't need to prove anything to you." "You're a scientist," Thomas replied. "Scientists investigate evidence. I'm offering you evidence, unless you're afraid of what you might find." The silence that followed was profound. The documentary cameras were rolling. The government officials were watching. Everyone present understood what had just happened. Thomas had publicly challenged Dr. Webb's integrity. Dr. Webb's face flushed red. "Afraid? You think I'm afraid? Fine. Let's do this. Let's go look at your little hole in the ground. And when it turns out to be nothing, which it will, I expect a public apology and a commitment that you'll stop spreading misinformation about the Nullarbor." "And if I'm right?" Thomas asked. Dr. Webb's smile was cruel. "You won't be." The fissure was exactly where Thomas had said it would be. A narrow crack in the limestone, unremarkable unless you knew what you were looking for. Cool air flowed from it, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and ancient minerals. Thomas geared up efficiently, his movements practiced and careful. Dr. Webb struggled with his harness, finally accepting help from one of his geologists with obvious irritation. Elder Douglas, despite his age, prepared to descend with quiet confidence. He'd explored caves in his youth, he explained, searching for sacred sites with his grandfather. They descended in single file. Thomas first, then Elder Douglas, then Dr. Webb and his 2 geologists, followed by Jennifer from the Heritage Department and 1 ABC documentary cameraman. The others waited at the surface, monitoring radio contact. The passage was exactly as treacherous as Thomas remembered. Dr. Webb complained constantly. The walls were too tight, the air was too damp, the whole thing was dangerous and probably violated safety regulations. Thomas ignored him, moving steadily downward, calling out warnings about loose rocks and tight squeezes. 40 minutes of descent. Dr. Webb's complaints gradually faded into labored breathing, and the occasional curse when he scraped against a rock. The temperature dropped. The darkness was absolute beyond their headlamps. The weight of the earth pressed down on them, and then the passage opened. Thomas emerged onto the ledge and stepped aside, letting the others follow. One by one, they came through the narrow opening into the vast chamber. One by one, their headlamps swept across the impossible space. Dr. Webb was the last to emerge. He stood on the ledge, his expensive helmet light dancing across the cathedral of stone. And for the first time in the entire ordeal, he was completely silent. The chamber was even more spectacular than Thomas remembered. The underground lake stretched at least 200 meters, its surface disturbed only by the occasional drip of water from the stalactites above. The ceiling rose into darkness so complete that their lights couldn't reach it. Mineral formations sparkled in their headlamps. Calcite crystals, aragonite needles, flowstone curtains that looked like frozen waterfalls. But what made everyone gasp was what stood at the far end of the chamber. A massive stalagmite formation that had been carved by ancient hands into the unmistakable shape of a serpent, its body coiling upward toward the ceiling. Aboriginal rock art covered the walls around it. Spirals, human figures, handprints in red ochre, symbols that told stories thousands of years old. Elder Douglas fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "Yunkura," he whispered. "The rainbow serpent. My grandfather's grandfather spoke of this place. We thought it was lost forever." The documentary cameraman was filming everything, his camera sweeping across the impossible space. Jennifer was speaking rapidly into her radio, trying to describe what they were seeing to the team on the surface. Dr. Webb's geologists were staring around in absolute shock, their scientific training warring with the evidence before their eyes. And Dr. Marcus Webb stood frozen on the ledge, his face pale, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Thomas walked to the edge of the underground lake and knelt down, filling a sample bottle with the crystal-clear water. "This lake," he said, quietly, "is fed by an aquifer we didn't know existed, which means the hydrogeology of the entire Nullarbor Plain needs to be reassessed. And this chamber?" He gestured to the vast space around them. "This is just one of them." "One?" Jennifer whispered. "You mean there are more?" Thomas nodded. "We've identified 83 distinct void signatures in this region alone. I believe we're standing at the edge of the most extensive undiscovered cave system on the Australian continent." Dr. Webb finally found his voice. That's impossible. The seismic data? The radar surveys? My report?" He trailed off, staring at his hands as if they might hold an answer. "Your report was incomplete," Thomas said without malice. "You surveyed during the wet season of 2003. The aquifer was saturated, which masked the void signatures. The limestone density readings were skewed by water content. You made conclusions based on limited data and then never questioned them again. But I had a team," Dr. Webb whispered. "We had equipment worth millions. We spent 3 years. You had everything except humility," Thomas replied softly. "You had everything except the willingness to admit you might not know everything." The silence in the chamber was profound. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness. Dr. Webb stood there, surrounded by impossible evidence, and something inside him visibly broke. His shoulders sagged. His authoritative posture crumbled. He looked suddenly old and small. "I ruined you," he said to Thomas, his voice hoarse. "I called you a fraud on national television. I filed legal complaints. I tried to destroy your credibility. And you were right. You were right the whole time." Thomas didn't respond immediately. He stood at the edge of the sacred lake, looking at his reflection in the still water. Finally he spoke. "I was right about the caves, but you were right about something too. I am an amateur. I don't have your education or your credentials. I don't have your experience. What I had was an open mind and a willingness to look where everyone else said there was nothing to see." He turned to face Dr. Webb fully. "You asked me once why I kept going after you rejected my grant. Why I mortgaged my house and risked everything for this. You want to know the truth? It wasn't about proving you wrong. It was about proving that the world still has mysteries left, that there are still places undiscovered, Still wonders hidden, still questions unanswered. And that those mysteries don't care about credentials. They reveal themselves to anyone curious enough to look and humble enough to admit they don't have all the answers. Dr. Webb closed his eyes. When he opened them again, tears were running down his face. I've spent 20 years being the expert, being the authority, being the man with all the answers. And it made me blind. It made me cruel. It made me... He couldn't finish. Elder Douglas stood and walked to Dr. Webb, placing a weathered hand on his shoulder. In our stories, the old man said gently, the rainbow serpent destroys those who are arrogant and greedy. But it also brings water to the thirstlands. It creates life where there was only emptiness. This place you're standing in, it's both. It destroys your pride, but it offers you wisdom, if you're willing to accept it.